So Hamas really fumbled the bag, is I think how the cool kids would say it these days. They screwed up, start to finish, like beginning on October 7th, and that's what we're going to talk about today. From their operational oversight of failing to dig in when they actually had boots on the ground in southern Israel, to the tactical misstep of not setting up any sort of real kill zone inside the Gaza Strip for when Israeli forces would move in, to their failure to adopt new technologies, new equipment, like drones, which were notably absent from the Hamas side throughout the entirety of this conflict. Now, before getting into all of this, just to level set, this is not me supporting Hamas. Hamas is bad. Their eventual elimination, we're getting closer by the day, is a good thing for the Palestinian people. It's a good thing for everyone in the Gaza Strip. It's a good thing for Israel. It's a good thing for the broader Middle East. What we're going to do today is try to learn from their mistakes so we can better prepare for this whenever the next conflict comes around. And fortunate for us, Hamas made a lot of mistakes. I wish they would have made more and earlier, but this is what we have to go off of. Now, starting out, Hamas on October 7th was kind of a victim of their own success, which I understand can kind of be a weird way to phrase this. What I mean is when we look at the opening hours and days, really, following the terrorist attack on October 7th, 2023, what we saw were a lot of small teams of Hamas militants moving into southern Israel. By and large, their focus, from everything we can tell at this point, was killing anyone and everyone they happened to come across, men, women, and children, and taking hostages. So these teams really weren't set up to establish any sort of medium to long-term presence inside of Israeli territory. And that's just notable based off of what they were carrying. We did see a couple isolated cases of some of these guys having packs full of rations and water, maybe like a day or two worth of supplies, but no large-scale resupply ever happened or even looked like it was set to take place. But imagine if it had, because it's not all that unbelievable. I mean, look at what Ukraine has done in Kursk, Russia in, August. They just did it again, kicked off another offensive into Kursk. But back in August, Ukrainian forces, and I need you to look past the capabilities of these two sides for this comparison, because I think we're actually going to get to where it makes sense, but don't compare the Ukrainian military to Hamas in this instance, just the strategic and operational advantage of how Ukraine went about this. So Ukraine pushed into Kursk, surprised the Russians. Russia didn't really know what was happening. They had to fall back. And before you know it, in the matter of a couple days, Ukraine had taken significant territory inside of Russia, about 1,200 square kilometers. Now, inside of those 1,200 square kilometers were Russian businesses and homes and schools and civilians. And Russia, not historically known for the accuracy of their, rocket, missile, or artillery strikes, had to hold off a little bit. They weren't immediately targeting the Ukrainians in some of these cities because they didn't know where the Ukrainians were versus their own Russian civilians. So what that meant was that it gave the Ukrainians some time to dig in. And when I say dig in, what I mean isn't necessarily like digging trenches, although we did see some of that in Kursk, but essentially setting up any sort of defensive position. And Ukraine went about this right away. They started making strong points and sending out kind of recon patrols in different areas, setting up drones overhead in certain avenues of approach to kind of protect this area for when the inevitable Russian counterattack would come. Now, that attack took like months to actually put together, and by the time they started to push back, they did see some success, but it has cost Russia and North Korea at this point quite a few troops to essentially kind of degrade that pocket a little bit, right? It's very, very costly for Russia to try to close that out. What if Hamas had done something even slightly similar? Right, so instead of just moving in foot soldiers with light arms, small arms, machine guns, things like that, what if they had loaded up pickup trucks and SUVs and things like that to follow on in the hours after the attack took place, bringing in things like landmines, anti-tank guided missiles, man-pads, man-portable air defense systems. All of those we have seen that Hamas has tons inside the Gaza Strip. Even recently, the IDF is still uncovering significant weapon stashes that Hamas has hidden all over the Gaza Strip. If they had brought just some of those in, set up some landmines, start to use ATGMs on any Israeli military vehicle that approaches that little pocket in southern Israel, and force the aircraft to stand off just a little bit because they've got these man-pads, you're talking about a drastically different fight right out the gate. Now, I got it. I'm not going to pretend like Hamas would have been able to hold this territory for any significant amount of time, but Hamas has been all about the PR victory, the propaganda victory from day one of this conflict, and think what they could have gotten out of that. Just digging in for, instead of being pushed out in a matter of days, what if it just took a couple weeks? Hamas could have raised their flag over Israeli settlements. I mean, that would still be circulating for its propaganda value. And Israel, when they decided it was finally time to move in and they were convinced they weren't going to be actually, targeting any of their own civilians in this pocket, Hamas would have been able to get footage of Israeli helicopters and jets and artillery destroying Israeli towns. Again, think about the PR victory for Hamas that would probably still be resonating across certain parts of the world today. Instead, they moved in with very limited supplies. A lot of them were cut off and killed, and then the rest of the fighters fell back pretty quickly into the Gaza Strip. Now, I can hear the argument that, what do you think, they're just going to sit there and get cut off and eliminated one by one by the IDF? I mean, yeah, that probably is what would have happened. I don't know that Dave Sinwar or Hanieh are necessarily known for caring about the lives of their fighters, or civilians for that matter, but think about what they did instead. They ran back into the Gaza Strip, an area of land that is arguably the most monitored in the entire world. And as we know now, Israel has no qualms about dropping munitions across just about every square inch of that territory. So these Hamas militants went from an area where they did not have the advantage, but they had reduced the Israeli advantage by kind of creating a new battlefield in southern Israel, and they ran away from that back to an area where they very quickly were targeted by massive Israeli airstrikes. Doesn't seem to have worked out very well, big picture, for Hamas. That's mistake one, which leads us into mistake number two, which is, where was this layered defense that everybody was so concerned about when Israeli forces started to maneuver into the Gaza Strip? Now, there was a period of time where Israel just hammered everything with airstrikes, and they had a lot of targets lined up over the years watching where these Hamas cells were operating. But a major concern, and we should note it was the same concern when Israel moved into southern Lebanon, and it didn't really happen there either, was that Hamas had to have known this was coming. Right? This was a bait. They grabbed hostages, 100 of which or so are still in Hamas captivity today as we record this. So they knew that Israel was coming in. They probably wouldn't just stop with airstrikes. So there's only a few ways into the Gaza Strip, and a major concern was, as soon as Israeli forces started to move in, they would hit these kill zones, if you will, areas seeded with dozens, hundreds maybe, of IEDs and landmines, destroying the tracked vehicles right out the gate. When they start to push engineering equipment forward, you would see anti-tank guided missiles start to destroy those one by one. There would be fortified firing positions, maybe overwatched with light, medium, or even heavy machine guns, and it could be pretty catastrophic for Israeli forces, right? I don't think anybody doubted that they would eventually get through, but it could have been very, very costly for the IDF. That just didn't really materialize. You kind of blinked, and they were like in the center of the Gaza Strip, which essentially ceded the initiative back to Israel. This is a time where Hamas, again, they would not have won the war, but they could have inflicted heavy casualties and maybe forced Israel to kind of reevaluate their strategy. Instead, they kind of just let Israel in and decided to take the fight from there. And what that looked like over time was the kind of slow, deliberate clearance of block by block, building by building, what still was standing. And it allowed Israeli forces to get underground and start to destroy some of these Hamas tunnel networks. But think about those same tunnel networks being used to kind of support and fight some sort of exterior battle. It didn't have to be on the very outskirts of the Gaza Strip, but just kind of attack, move back, attack, move back, attack, move back. And we saw that in onesies and twosies, but not any large-scale coordinated type offensive. And look, I think that was a pretty significant mistake, and like we said, ceded the initiative right back over to the Israeli forces. And that leads us into the last major mistake here, the failure to adopt new technologies, or drones. Where the hell were they? Right, so we saw on October 7th, Hamas started using drones to take out some of the surveillance equipment, Israeli surveillance equipment on the border. That kind of set the stage, like, great, this is going to be just like all the other conflicts playing out right now, where drones play a critical piece. And then they just didn't. Now, keep in mind that all of this was playing out about a year and a half into the war in Ukraine. People around the world are watching drone videos day in and day out and seeing how much of an impact that has in the modern battlefield. Then you get into Gaza, and they just aren't there. I mean, since October 7th, since Israel moved forces into the Gaza Strip is a better way to say it, we've seen 4, maybe, videos of Hamas drones dropping munitions on Israeli soldiers. It's nothing, right? This is the technology that has arguably allowed HTS, a designated terrorist organization, they looked at it and said, we're going to need that if we want to topple the Assad regime. Now, that was just a couple weeks ago, but Hamas seems to have decided that the best strategy here was more unguided rockets. Those Qassam 107 millimeter. Now, they do manufacture those at home, and there's a whole different story here about, they'd have to buy the drones and they'd have to be shipped into the Gaza Strip, which isn't the easiest thing to do, not by a long shot, whereas the rockets can be manufactured there. But instead of these rockets, they had a long time to do it, right? It's not like drones were just coming about in September, right before Hamas launched their attack. And think about how drastically different this war would have been when instead of, a handful of 107 millimeter Qassam rockets being launched from Gaza, half of them probably impacting still inside of the Gaza Strip, sometimes even killing their own Palestinian civilians. The other half maybe make it out into Israeli airspace. Some are shot down and some just impact God knows where, nowhere near an actual target. Instead of that strategy, what if 3, 4, 5 times a day a Hamas fighter emerged from a tunnel, set up an antenna, dropped an FPV drone, and flew it into Israeli troops somewhere nearby? Close range. Doesn't even have to leave the Gaza Strip. Think about how drastically different that war is, how drastically different this war is. How much it changes if day in and day out Israeli forces are having to dodge FPV drones like we're seeing Russian and Ukrainian forces deal with day in and day out. Now, there is a bit of a caveat here worth mentioning. That's the electronic warfare capabilities of the Israeli military. It is substantial. It exists, no doubt. But there's always a period of time there where there's gaps in that coverage and they could be taken advantage of. And I don't think the reason that we're not seeing more Hamas drones is because of the electronic warfare coverage, because even then you would see these drones being shot down. You would see the remnants on the ground. You'd see the electronic warfare working. Instead, we're just not seeing Hamas use drones like hardly at all. The drones that they are using are those kind of like medium range, somewhat guided missiles, if you will. Again, very slow, tend to be intercepted pretty easily if they even make it out of the Gaza Strip at all. So those are the 3 major mistakes that Hamas made in their war with Israel, other than just, the obvious one, starting the war in the first place probably wasn't good for the longevity of the organization or the health of their leadership, but that's kind of already proven out. But nonetheless, thought it was worth diving into these, try to dissect a little bit errors that have been made so we can all try to learn from that going forward. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.